This is Latter-day Presentations, where we discuss topics and issues of faith for Latter-day Saints. Welcome to today's presentation. In this presentation, I want to talk about sacred history. At some point, most believers are going to come across an alternative to sacred history. For me, recently, I was reading an article about Christianity that was written by a non-believer. And this individual gave some reasons why he thinks that the resurrection of Jesus Christ did not actually happen. And he provided some of his own ideas as to how it could be explained in other ways, aside from the witness testimony that we see in the scriptures. Now, when this happens, it can really rattle our faith. It can cause us to become really unsettled, because sometimes some of these alternative explanations seem kind of reasonable. So in this presentation, I want to explore how and why this happens. How do people come up with alternatives to sacred history that are closed off to the possibility of miracles? And what can we understand about those thought processes? Now, as I begin this presentation, I want to say if you are somebody who is not open to the possibility of miracles, I would just ask that you pass on the rest of this presentation. You're not the intended audience for this presentation, and that's okay. Doesn't make you a bad person if you don't believe in miracles. This presentation really is designed for believers. I'm going to have some pretty frank discussion of miracles, and if you don't believe in them, it might be a little bit distressing. So as we begin this presentation, I want to start by telling a personal story. Years ago, I went to work in a remote location where people were drilling for oil. And I went to work on a project that was centered around the maintenance of machines and buildings in these locations. Now, the place where I went to work was far away from civilization. So they had built what were kind of like college dormitories to house people who worked in these locations. And most people who worked there shared their job with another person. They would fly up on site and stay there for a couple of weeks and then go home for a couple of weeks, while somebody else took their place during the next 2 weeks. And they would rotate 2 weeks on, 2 weeks off. That's how most jobs were. But since I was not familiar with that industry and that location, I decided when I signed up for this project to go up for a full month. But as a believing Latter-day Saint, taking the sacrament is pretty important to me. So I was a little bit worried. How am I going to take the sacrament if I'm far away from any church buildings and congregations for an entire month? So before I left for that first month away from home, I said a prayer, and I basically said, Lord, help me find a way to take the sacrament while I'm working up there. And then I got on my flights and made my way up there. And when I walked into the main building with my bags, I saw there was a room key waiting for me. Now the rooms were assigned kind of like a hotel. There were a couple of staff who had computers with databases and a software program that would match room requests with openings. So people would come and stay for a couple of weeks in a particular room and then leave, and another person would take that room after it was cleaned. And sometimes people would change rooms in the middle of their stay. They might stay for 4 days in one room and then 8 days in another room. So there was a lot of movement. Now I got my key and I went to my room to drop off my bags. And my plan was I'm going to drop off my bags and then I'm going to go and meet my new coworkers and start to get familiar with where I would be working. But when I walked into the room, I saw that the previous person's bags were still in the room. They were all packed up and ready to go, but I figured something had happened and this person didn't have a place to put their bags and they would come and get them later on during the day. So I set down my things, and as I did so, I pulled out my big paper quad of scriptures and I set those to the side. And then I left and went to meet my new coworkers. When I came back to my room that evening, I walked into the room and I saw that the previous guy's bags were gone. And I noticed next to my scriptures, there was a tithing envelope. And on the back of the tithing envelope was written the location of sacrament meeting. I said, wow, that's an incredible coincidence. The person who stayed in this room before me must have been a Latter-day Saint and saw my scriptures and realized he didn't know me. So he wanted to let me know where sacrament meeting was. I considered that a miraculous answer to a prayer. I still do to this day. But I figured maybe it was just a coincidence. Maybe there are a lot of Latter-day Saints here. And I went to that sacrament meeting expecting to see a lot of Latter-day Saints. And no, it was just me and that guy who had scribbled the location of sacrament meeting on the tithing envelope. He and I laughed and we talked for a while. Out of thousands of people in those buildings, he and I were the only Latter-day Saints there at the time. So again, it's one of those experiences in my life that I consider to be a miracle. But here's part of the story that I don't normally tell. Not long after that, I was walking through the main building and I looked on one of the walls and there was a sign. And the sign listed the religious services in the building, including our religious services. Now again, I didn't notice that sign until after I had gone to sacrament meeting. But let's pretend that I wrote a biography of my life. And in that biography, I said that I took a job far away, didn't know how I would find sacrament meeting, but God gave me a little miracle that showed me where to go. Let's say I put that in my biography. But then a non-believing biographer of my life wanted to create a narrative of this experience that did not involve a miracle. He might research and look at pictures that people had posted online of the interior of that building from that time frame, and he might see hanging on the wall this list of religious services. And in his biography of my life, he might say, Dan claimed to have experienced a miracle, but actually, no, there was a sign on the wall telling where all the religious services were. Now, it is true that there was a sign on the wall, but I did not notice that sign until after the fact. But there's another possibility. Let's say another non-believing biographer were to write a story of my life. And in this situation, he were to track down that individual who was there on site with me and say, did you know Dan while he was working there? And let's say the man said, yeah, I was the one who told him where sacrament meeting was when he arrived. Now that statement would be true. And the biographer might then conclude, oh, there's no miracle here. Dan was just told by another Latter-day Saint where sacrament meeting was. Technically, that is entirely true. So you can see that there are ways that a non-believer might rationalize this experience. You can see that there is a divide between approaches to telling history. When we're open to miracles, we have one set of possibilities. When we are not open, we have another more narrow set of possibilities. Let's talk about another example. Let's say I start feeling some aches and pains, and I go to my doctor, and my doctor does some tests, and he calls me into his office and says, Dan, you have a rare bone disease, and your prognosis is not good. People just do not get better from this disease. And I go home, and I call my ministering brothers and ask them to come and give me a priesthood blessing. And in that blessing, I'm promised a healing. But after the blessing, I'm still achy. I'm still in pain. I have not been healed. And let's say I wake up the next morning and I still have not been healed. But then during that day, my doctor calls and he says, I need you to come back to my office because I have news for you. So I go back to his office and he says, you are the luckiest patient in the history of modern medicine because this disease that you have, it has been successfully treated on one occasion. And it was fairly recent in an experimental study. And one of the two doctors who led that study is transferring to this hospital, and he is going to be working here starting next week. What are the odds of that? Now, obviously, if the doctor does not believe in miracles, he's going to say, this is an incredible coincidence. But if I believe in miracles, I might label this what I would call a logistical miracle. And that's where God places people and resources around us in a time of need. I personally believe that a lot of miracles and a lot of what we call tender mercies are logistical in nature. It's God placing things into our environment to help us. But again, let's say I'm writing the story of my life. What might I say of this experience? I would probably say I was healed through a miracle, but a non-believer would say his illness was resolved through the application of modern medicine. And technically, that second statement would be correct. It would just be narrow and inadequate in describing what really happened. Now, this hypothetical example that I've given is actually based on a real-life example that I participated in years ago. It was one of the most astonishing miracles I've personally ever witnessed. And how does this apply to sacred history? Well, with the scriptures in particular, we have a lot of stories of God's interventions in people's lives. And in the New Testament in particular, we have stories of healings and visions and other kinds of miracles. Now, I've recommended this book before. It's by Craig Keener. He's a New Testament scholar, and it's called Miracles. And in it, he discusses the problems that non-believing scholars face as they create alternative histories around the New Testament. This book is kind of expensive, but I recommend if you ever see it on sale, pick it up. It's an invaluable resource. Let's read an excerpt. As Talbert notes, the question as to whether miracles are possible reflects the understanding of possibility in one's worldview, and worldviews are highly resistant to disconfirmation. The materialistic worldview represented by Ludemann dictates that the world was and is ruled by iron physical laws that not even God could or can bend. This is, however, a worldview and not an argument. Scholars differ in their evaluations of what is possible, evaluations that in turn shape how they evaluate the historical reliability of claims in Acts and the Gospels. One philosopher warns that those who dismiss miracles yet are unwilling to offer solid arguments need to admit that they have a faith commitment, which precludes the possibility of miracles. Now, this is relevant to a statement that President Russell M. Nelson made recently in General Conference, and some people found this statement kind of upsetting. Let's see what he said.
When someone you love attacks truth, think celestial and don't question your testimony. The Apostle Paul prophesied that in the latter times some shall depart from the faith, giving heed to seducing spirits and doctrines of devils. There is no end to the adversary's deceptions. Please be prepared. Never take counsel from those who do not believe. Seek guidance from voices you can trust, from prophets, seers, and revelators, and from the whisperings of the Holy Ghost, who will show unto you the things what ye should do.
So we need to note here that when prophets speak, we interpret the things that they say. Whether we are aware of that interpretive process in our minds or not, it is happening. Now, is President Nelson saying that we should never discuss anything with non-believers? Obviously not, because he himself engages with non-believers and takes advice and counsel from them on any number of things. He has done that all throughout his life. So that's obviously not what he's implying in his statement. But when it comes to matters of faith, there are very severe limitations in what non-believers can offer to us as we evaluate things like Scripture. Let's read another quote from Craig Keener. He said, "We must be honest with ourselves and our students about the philosophic grid through which we sift the evidence. We must not confuse our presuppositions with the evidence, nor dare we confuse them with neutrality. As Alan J. Torrance observes, the assessment of probability is in no small measure a function of one's epistemic base. If one presupposes dogmatic anti-supernaturalism, one will assign to all miracle claims a 0 probability. This verdict is not necessary, however, for those open to other possibilities. If someone has already assigned a 0 probability to miracles, they are not going to have much to offer us in discussions of faith. And as this quote indicates, how we assess probability of miracles really depends on our epistemic base. So let's talk about that term. Epistemology is how we arrive at our views of what is true and what is believable. So our epistemic base is a set of assumptions that determine our possible conclusions about what is believable, what is true. Think of it almost like a box upon which we build our views of reality. Now, if that base allows for miracles and revelation, then as we read the Scriptures and consider miracle stories, we're going to be open to the possibility that those claims are entirely valid. However, if those things are outside of our epistemic base, we're going to dismiss them and say that somebody was mistaken or delusional or dishonest. I've shown this image in other presentations. And basically in this image, I'm trying to show that our thinking is a product of a lot of different factors. And this includes our thinking around miracles. Our thinking around miracles is affected by our culture, our worldview, our life experiences, and so much more. These things are very important elements of our epistemic base, which determines our conclusions about what is possible, including miracles. Now, a lot of people who doubt and dismiss miracles and stories of supernatural events think that they are the ones bringing rationality to the table. My views are logical and reasonable and rational, whereas believers, because they believe in miracles, they're operating from a standpoint of irrationality. Now, this is a very self-serving delusion because our mind follows our heart. A lot of us would like to believe that our mind dictates to our heart what is true. We reason, we think about things, and emotions and intuitions are only secondary. They're not really relevant to finding out what is true. But philosophers and now neuroscientists have a very different understanding. And they understand that our intuitions are actually very more powerful in steering our thought processes, even ones that we consider to be logical and rational. As long ago as 1650, philosopher Thomas Hobbes said, "The thoughts are to the desires as scouts and spies, to range abroad and find the way to the things desired." In 1739, David Hume said, "Reason is, and ought only to be, the slave of the passions, and can never pretend to any other office than to serve and obey them." More recently, psychologist Jonathan Haidt, in his 2012 book, The Righteous Mind, says, "Each individual reasoner is really good at one thing, finding evidence to support the position he or she already holds, usually for intuitive reasons." In other words, our heart, our intuitions, and a lot of non-rational factors in our thinking, they steer our powers of reason. And that's kind of a scary thing to consider. Because when we understand that, we might ask the question, am I just irrational about everything? Well, not necessarily. We can still have very good rational reasons for believing things. But when we are aware of these dynamics between the heart and the mind, we have a much more realistic view of the search for truth. And I want to talk about an application of this, and it has to do with the futility of debate. Now, I've said in other presentations that debates are a typically male form of trying to arrive at the truth. The idea is you put two people together and let them make their arguments, and I will evaluate those arguments, and seeing the different arguments that are presented, I will know what's true. Here are some examples from YouTube. Debates on whether Jesus actually rose from the dead. And then one down below, a debate between two Catholics on whether the Pope is legitimate. If you're a person who loves to watch debates over faith, it might be a little bit depressing, a little bit deflating to know that when people debate, they're not arriving at what is true. Debate is really just a contest of skill. And a lot of times debates lead people way further away from reality than where they were when they started watching the debate. I'm going to repeat that. A lot of times debates will introduce people to delusionary thinking and reinforce it, leading them further away from reality. The debate that I've referenced here between these two Catholics about whether the Pope is legitimate caused a lot of consternation and frustration among believing Catholics because the individual who was arguing that Pope Francis is illegitimate leveled a ton of accusations, and the other guy in the debate just simply wasn't able to keep up. But the ability to accuse, which is so powerful in debate contexts, is not something that leads people to reality. More often than not, it just reflects someone's poisoned intuitions toward other people. So now with that all in mind, I'll acknowledge that I am somebody who watches debates from time to time. But I don't carry any illusions about what debate actually can or cannot do for me. Debate is not a mechanism for arriving at the truth, especially when the debaters are not fully transparent and open about the dominant role of intuition in their belief system. And now I want to move on to another topic, and this is miracles and memory. And I think it's important to discuss this because miracle stories usually come to us from people's memories. And a lot of times when we think about memories as something that we just recall. Like something happened, it's stored in my brain, and if I'm going to tell the story of what happened, I just need to recall what happened. But memories are actually reconstructed, not recalled. And to describe how this works, I'm going to suggest something that you could actually even do as an experiment. Next time you're with a group of people, let's say like at a family reunion. At a number of my family reunions, we've had outdoor games like baseball. Next time you're in a situation like this, record what happens. Pull out your smartphone and record the baseball game. And then a couple of weeks afterward, ask everybody who was involved what they think were the highlights of the game and write those down. Then, some years later, let's say 5 years later, ask them that same question. Say, what do you remember about that baseball game? And you will notice that their answers are going to be a little bit different. They're probably going to be united on some basic elements of the story, but there's also going to be some divergence. One of them might say, I remember when Mike got up to bat and something hilarious happened. And then another person will say, no, that wasn't Mike at bat. Mike was the pitcher. You'll start to see some details diverge a little bit over time. And if you ask them that same question 20 years later, you're going to see more divergence in the details. You might even see examples of people mixing and matching different baseball games that happened in different family reunions and sort of conflating details over time. This is normal because when we are giving our memories of things, we are reaching back and reconstructing what happened. So this is why when we read sacred history, like the scriptures, for example, it should not surprise us at all to see variations in what people remember about various different events. That is completely normal. Now, skeptics will look at those discrepancies and conclude that the core event did not happen. Look, if you get a different story about who was at bat versus who was pitching, then there must not have even been a baseball game. That is how skeptics wave off a lot of the stories that we find in Scripture. But if you do this experiment, then you know there was a baseball game. It was recorded. But just due to the way the human brain functions in reconstructing memory, we do see variations in the details that people remember about things over time. And I want to give a personal example from my own memory. When I was about 12 years old, I hiked a mountain in California called Mount Whitney. And it was an amazing experience. And 15 years later, I went back and I hiked it again, this time as a grown-up. And when I drove up to the parking lot where the trail begins, I had in my mind my own memories of what that whole entire hike was like. But when I actually started doing the hike again, nothing looked as I remembered it. Everything seemed completely different. But the fact that I had these different memories does not mean that I did not hike Mount Whitney when I was 12. It just means that my memories over time shifted in some ways. That is completely normal. And with that in mind, I want to tell another story. When I was a teenager, I went on a long hike over 40 miles in the Sierra Nevada mountains. I did this hike with my church young men's group. And at the end of the hike, we returned to our vehicles that we had parked for a few days during our long hike. We opened up the vehicles and put our bags into the vehicles, and then we walked over and jumped into the nearby river. We had been so sweaty and dirty, it was really refreshing to jump into that cool water. But then we went back to our vehicles, and one of those vehicles was a van. And the guy who had the keys to that van realized that he had dropped the keys somewhere. Now, this was a problem because we were nowhere near home and we needed to drive home. And the way we got home was a pretty remarkable logistical miracle. And I describe it in an article that I wrote at Nauvoo Neighbor called Does Revelation Need to Be Original? I'll put a link to that in the show notes. And it's a miracle story that I've carried in my mind for many years. But I never wrote it down until fairly recently. And I've always had this nagging suspicion that I did not remember it right. After all these years, maybe the story of this miracle only existed in my mind. But a few years ago, I went to a funeral, and there was the man who was our young men's leader at the time. And I said, wait a minute, here is a good time for me to test my memory of this story. And I walked up to him and I said, hey, do you remember that amazing incident where we were able to get home from our hike in the Sierras without having car keys? And he said, yeah, I remember that. And I said, I'd like you to tell me that story. And I was a little bit nervous because I thought, what if there's a big discrepancy in our memories? But he related the story, and it was almost exactly as I remembered it too. And the reason I bring up this story is I've been telling you that it's normal to have variations in our memory over time. But it's also true that sometimes our memories of things are actually crystal clear for decades. That happened in this instance for me. So we shouldn't automatically be suspicious of something just because it was recalled at a later date. And now I want to return to discussing academic scholarship and how it relates to these issues. And I want to talk through another imaginary scenario. Let's say I went through a period of doubt in my life, and I prayed to know if God is listening to me. And at that moment, I saw a light in the sky. And let's say that I took that light in the sky as a sign that God is there, He's listening, He's aware of me. But let's say that some academic researchers are skeptical of my claim, and so they want to find ways to dismiss it. And let's say one of them writes an academic paper saying that this thing that I saw was a meteor, and another one says it was military aircraft, and another one says it was a rocket launch. Another one says I was hallucinating, and another one says it was just fireworks. And so these are the approaches they take to dismiss my claim that I experienced anything unusual or miraculous. And let's say that each of these academic papers is thoroughly researched, well-documented, well-reasoned, rational, and peer-reviewed. And let's say that each of these academic papers countering my story is 30 pages in length. Well, there's a problem here, because only one of these could possibly be correct. Now, let's say that the thing that I saw was a meteor. The meteor is actually the reason why I saw a light in the sky at that moment. Well, what does that tell us? It tells us that with these other academic papers, we have 120 pages of research that is thoroughly researched, well-documented, well-reasoned, rational, peer-reviewed, and false. Now, if you think about how this applies to how people have dismissed the coming forth of the Book of Mormon, for example, you can see that academia has a serious problem, and sometimes they're actually honest about it. This is a book by a non-believing scholar named John Dominic Crossan. And in this book, he talks about historical Jesus studies. And those are where scholars have tried to use secular, non-believing tools of history to give an alternative to the story of Jesus that we find in the Gospels. Here's what Crossan says. He says, historical Jesus research is becoming something of a scholarly bad joke. There is Jesus as a political revolutionary, by S.G.F. Brandon, as a magician by Morton Smith, as a Galilean charismatic by Geza Vermes, as a Galilean rabbi by Bruce Chilton, as a Hillelite or proto-Pharisee by Harvey Falk, and as an eschatological prophet by E.P. Sanders. Crossan says that stunning diversity is an academic embarrassment, and he is absolutely correct. Because if you read all of these studies, including Crossan's study, with the understanding that only one of these could possibly be correct, well, these studies amount to 2,318 pages of research, and at a minimum, 1,774 pages of these studies are erroneous. They are giving you a historical portrait of Jesus that is brilliant, well-researched, well-documented, and completely false. Now, I will say on a personal level, John Dominic Crossan did me a massive favor, because in his own studies, he dismisses the miracle stories of the New Testament. And reading his thinking, I came across a really clear instance of where he developed a brilliant analysis to reject a miracle that I have personally witnessed. To give you an idea of what that means, let's say you drive a Honda minivan. So you know from personal experience that Honda minivans exist. And let's say I deliver to you a 200-page research paper of the highest academic quality, arguing that Honda minivans do not actually exist. What would you conclude? You would obviously conclude that I'm capable of generating some very sophisticated delusions. And sometimes when we read things that are written by smart people that discount the reality of miracles, We might assume, hey, this person has a point because he's smarter than I am. But that is not necessarily true. The fact that somebody has a really powerful intellect does not mean that they are capable of giving you a more accurate picture of reality. People who are really intellectually gifted are capable of creating and maintaining some really powerful and sophisticated delusions and falsehoods. We definitely see this when we read the work of non-believing scholars who create really sophisticated denials of realities that we have personally observed. And now I want to close with some common questions. And one of them is, should we ever be skeptical of claims of miracles? And the answer is yes. The fact that somebody claims something doesn't mean it's automatically true. Early in my experience as a missionary, I remember sitting in a missionary discussion where we were talking about God, and there was a lady in the room who interrupted us and told us a story of how one time she was sitting in that room and she just saw a magical glowing ball floating around in the room. As she told this story, I could sense that something was really off. So when you hear stories of miracles and you sense that something's off, that might be an indicator that the person is delusional in some way. And I want to bring up something that I've heard before. Well, if you believe in the miracle stories of the Gospels, what about the Greek myths? Do you believe in those miracle stories too? And that's what we call a false equivalency. I studied the Greek myths when I was a kid. You read stories of Zeus and Aphrodite and Hercules. And yes, there are plenty of stories of supernatural events. But the Greek myths were formed in a time when people explained all natural phenomena as being the result of the actions of the gods. By contrast, the scriptures give us historical narratives that are often attested by multiple actual real people. Yes, it is true that sometimes the authors of scripture have used allegory and poetry and other genres. But a lot of times in scripture, we are getting eyewitness accounts of things. And when something comes to us through eyewitness accounts, especially if they're multiply attested, that's very different from a myth that is told in a culture in an attempt to explain how the natural world works. Those are things that we can evaluate on very, very different grounds. And as we evaluate discussions of miracles, discernment is very important. And I bring that up because there are people who like to deceive other people with fake miracle stories. And we also know from Scripture that Satan has the power to create signs and wonders. So again, discernment is something that is very important. And one of the ways that we can discern and even evaluate the credibility of a story is using common ways that we evaluate the credibility of witnesses. In a court of law, for example, when somebody comes forward with a claim, I have experienced something, I've seen something, I was there, we ask questions about the witness. Is this person a sober-minded person? Are they being coerced in any way? Are they normally a clear-headed person? Are they motivated by financial gain or not? Are they bearing testimony against their own self-interest? And is their witness testimony corroborated by other people? That last question might be the most powerful of all. And it speaks to why I believe in the restored gospel. Because in our sacred history, as members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, we have a lot of miracle stories from early church history around the time of Joseph Smith and onward. And I might be more able to dismiss those stories if I were not seeing those same phenomena in the church right now in the present day. Latter-day Saints in our day and age are experiencing many of the same things that the early saints claim to have experienced. And that makes us corroborating witnesses of the restoration. This is why when somebody says, I want to learn more about church history, I recommend that they start more recently and work backward in time. First, get a clear picture of how saints experience the gospel in the present day. And once you have a good grasp of that, the experiences of early saints become a lot more understandable. And finally, should we be unsettled when people create alternatives to our sacred history? Well, the answer is no. People who carry a bias against the existence of miracles are always going to be able to create counter-narratives of sacred history. And as I demonstrated earlier, they might even be able to create those counter-narratives using facts. Think of what I said about that sign on the wall in the building in the story that I opened with. It is possible to create narratives of human history and experience that are rational, persuasive, and false. Non-believing scholars have been doing this for a very long time, and they will continue to do so in the future. We can evaluate our faith and our sacred history using a rigorous and mature epistemology. We don't need to panic over the fact that other people are always going to be able to create any number of counter-narratives to sacred history. So I hope this presentation has been a helpful exercise to you. I hope it's helpful for thinking about our faith. Thank you for joining me. This has been an episode of Latter-day Presentations. We would like to remind viewers that our channel represents our own views and not necessarily any official positions of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Thanks again for joining us.